If a rogue wave had hit the Cyclops, I believe she would have quickly rolled and that she would have probably slipped below the surface.
When the USS Cyclops vanished in 1918, it became the deadliest ship disaster in U.S. Navy history that was not caused by battle. No wreck was found, no bodies were recovered, the ocean gave no clues, and the Navy had no answers. For decades, the silence was filled with rumors and strange theories.
309 people lost their lives on board the USS Cyclops when she disappeared.
But when scientists finally stopped chasing myths and focused on details everyone else had missed, they uncovered a chain of events so brutal that the disappearance suddenly made sense. The last voyage of the USS Cyclops.
The USS Cyclops was a Proteus-class collier ship of the United States Navy.
Cyclops was a big steel coal ship, about 540 feet long and about 65 feet wide, with a deep draft that let her carry a huge load. When she was full, she displaced close to 19,400 tons of water, and she could haul more than 8,000 tons of coal in normal service, and even more when pushed into overload. She was built in Philadelphia by William Cramp and Sons and launched in the year 1910. Part of a group of sister ships known as the Proteus class. Her job was vital. She carried coal to the large warships of the United States Navy so that the battleships and cruisers could stay at sea and keep moving. Before the United States entered the war, Cyclops had already been heavily used. She steamed across the Baltic Sea to fuel the 2nd Division of the Atlantic Fleet. She ran up and down the East Coast from Newport to the Caribbean, topping up ships that were on patrol.
Its keel was laid at the Cramp shipyard of the William Cramp and Sons Shipbuilding Company.
During the United States occupation of Veracruz in Mexico in the years 1914 and 1915, she sat offshore and shoveled coal to the warships watching the harbor. The work was dirty and exhausting. Men spent hours in the holds with shovels, breathing coal dust while the heat from the boilers seeped through the steel. But the ship did what she was built to do, and the Navy relied on her without thinking too much about it. When the United States entered the First World War in 1917, Cyclops changed from a support ship in peacetime to an important link in a wartime supply chain. She was fully commissioned in May of that year and sent across the Atlantic with a convoy to Saint-Nazaire in France, carrying coal for American ships now working in European waters. After that, she returned to the East Coast, went up to Halifax in Nova Scotia, and kept running coal along the seaboard. In early January of 1918, she was assigned to the Naval Overseas Transportation Service, the branch that moved goods and fuel for the war effort. Her new orders sent her south into the South Atlantic, where British and American ships were watching for German raiders and submarines. The man in charge of this big, tired coal ship was Lieutenant Commander George Worley. On the bridge, he looked like any other Navy officer running a transport.
And no one wounded. We will have the damage repaired in a few hours.
That is good. That is good.
But his story was far more complicated. Investigators later found that he had been born in Germany under the name Johann Friedrich Weichmann in the 1860s. As a young man, he jumped ship in San Francisco in the 1870s and stayed there. Over time, he ended up running a saloon in the rough Barbary Coast District. At some point, he changed his name to Worley, learned the trade of a sea captain in the merchant world, and built up enough experience to command civilian cargo ships that ran back and forth across the Pacific. When the United States Navy needed more officers for its new auxiliary fleet, he was brought in and given the rank of lieutenant commander in the Naval Auxiliary Reserve in February of 1917. The way he treated people on his ship left deep marks. Former crew members later told Navy investigators that Worley cursed officers and sailors in public over small issues. They said he sometimes hit men, and in one story, he chased a junior officer around the deck with a pistol in his hand. On calmer days, he supposedly walked the ship wearing long underwear and a derby hat while giving orders. Sailors complained that he would lock up experienced officers and give important jobs to men who did not yet know the work. The tension got so bad that about 40 crew members signed a petition accusing him of being drunk, abusive, and unfit to command. Even so, the Navy did not remove him. By early January of 1918, the war gave Cyclops a new mission. She left Norfolk, Virginia, with a full load of coal bound for Rio de Janeiro in Brazil. The South Atlantic Patrol Squadron there needed fuel, and Cyclops was a workhorse that could bring it in one trip.
Get that off immediately in case we run into trouble. Aye, sir. Check radar.
The Atlantic crossing was rough but routine. She reached Rio later that month, unloaded her coal, and for a moment, her holds were empty, and the crew could breathe air that did not taste like dust. The visit also brought a change that would turn out to be crucial. Instead of sailing back light, Cyclops was ordered to return to the United States carrying a new cargo that American war factories desperately needed. That cargo was manganese ore. Manganese ore is rock that is rich in the metal manganese. When you mix manganese into molten steel in the right amounts, it makes the steel stronger and more resistant to wear. This matters if you are building gun barrels, armor plates, and heavy tools, which is exactly what the United States and its allies were doing in enormous quantities by 1918. Brazilian mines could supply this ore, so Cyclops was told to load it and bring it home. The ship loaded roughly 10,000 to 11,000 tons of manganese ore. That was heavier than her usual coal load and close to the limit of what the hull could handle. Manganese ore is far denser than coal, so the same space in the hold weighed much more than the crew was used to. A new face joined the ship at this point. Alfred Louis Moreau Gottschalk, the American consul general in Rio de Janeiro, boarded Cyclops to travel home to the United States.
27 knots, course 295. We should meet them at first light.
We'll proceed on that course at that speed.
Aye, aye, sir.
A consul general is a senior diplomat who looks after American citizens and business interests in a foreign city. Gottschalk had been in Brazil for years and wanted to return on leave. Even before Cyclops left Brazilian waters, there were warning signs that all was not well with the ship herself. Worley reported that the starboard engine had a cracked cylinder and could not run. A cracked cylinder in a steam engine means that one of the big metal tubes where steam pushes the piston has split. That engine has to be shut down, or it will destroy itself. A local survey board in Brazil looked at the problem, agreed that the engine was damaged, but decided that the ship could still make it back to the United States if she took it slow. That decision meant that Cyclops would head north across the Atlantic with only one working engine, less power to hold her course in heavy seas, and fewer options if the weather turned bad. With her oar loaded and one engine limping, Cyclops put to sea again. She left Rio de Janeiro on February 16th and steamed up the coast to Salvador in the Brazilian state of Bahia. She arrived there on February 20th. Salvador was a chance to check cargo, coal, and machinery before the long stretch home. 2 days later, on February 22nd, she headed out again, this time pointed north for the Caribbean and then the American East Coast. If you walked along the side of the hull at that point, you would have seen a painted symbol near the middle called the Plimsoll mark. This mark is a simple set of lines that shows how deep a ship can safely sit in the water with a given load. On Cyclops, witnesses later said that the water was up over that line. In plain language, the ship looked overloaded. To sailors, a waterline that high means less freeboard, which is the distance between the deck and the water. Less freeboard gives big waves an easier path onto the deck and into the hatches, especially if the covers are old or worn.
Cloud from the Glorious, at a distance of about 30 kilometers away.
The next stop was one that had not been in the original plan. In late February, Cyclops made an unscheduled call at Bridgetown, the port of Barbados in the eastern Caribbean. She arrived there near the end of the month, and her captain went ashore to speak with the American consul, Charles Livingston. Worley told Livingston that the ship's engines were in very poor condition, that he needed around 600 tons of coal to make it to the next port, and that he did not have enough money on hand to pay for it. Livingston sent a message to Washington about the situation, reporting both the engine trouble and the request for coal. People on the island watched the ship at anchor, noted how low she sat, and then saw her head out to sea again. On March 4th, 1918, the ship left Bridgetown bound for Baltimore, Maryland. According to her orders, she was not supposed to stop anywhere else. From Barbados onward, every mile she steamed took her farther from witnesses and closer to the open Atlantic. After that, the record turns thin. No confirmed radio distress calls from Cyclops were ever logged. There were no clear messages saying she had engine failure, flooding, fire, or attack. There were also no ship logs from other vessels that matched a proven sighting. For years, a story circulated that an American tanker named Amolco had seen Cyclops near the Virginia Capes on March 9th, but later research showed that the dates and locations did not line up. Baltimore expected Cyclops around March 13th. When that day passed with no sign of the ship, officers in the Navy Department still hoped she might simply be delayed. One engine was down. She was heavy and slow. It was possible, at least on paper, that she had eased her speed to ride through the storm, or diverted to another port with failed machinery. Days passed. Weeks passed. No radio contact came in. No surprise arrival was reported at any harbor along the coast. In early June, Assistant Secretary of the Navy Franklin Roosevelt signed a notice declaring that the ship was officially lost and that everyone on board was presumed dead. Later that summer, the Secretary of the Navy repeated that verdict in his annual report. This was, and still is, the largest loss of life in a single ship that the United States Navy has ever suffered outside of direct combat. In the summer of 1918, explain, the Navy could only tell the public that Cyclops had been lost at sea with all hands, somewhere between the Caribbean and the American coast. There was no broken hull pulled into a dry dock, no lifeboat washed ashore with survivors, no pile of wreckage floating in a shipping lane. The official records admitted that the cause of the loss was unknown. In the spaces left blank by that statement, people would soon start to pour every kind of guess and story they could think of. The rumors and theories that followed the USS Cyclops.
309 people lost their lives on board the USS Cyclops when she disappeared.
The easiest target was the man in charge. Once reporters and officials learned that the captain, George Worley, had actually been born in Germany under another name and had later reinvented himself in the United States, the story almost wrote itself. Past complaints from sailors about his harsh temper, strange habits, and uneven treatment of the crew were pulled back out, this time with a darker edge. Old stories about him chasing an officer with a pistol or storming around the ship in long underwear and a derby hat suddenly sounded less like colorful sea tales and more like signs of a man who might snap. In a country already fighting Germany in a world war, the fact that the captain had been born there and had many German friends was enough to feed suspicion. It did not matter that he had sailed under the American flag for decades. People wanted a face to blame, and they locked onto his. Very quickly, stories about an odd, hot-headed skipper spiraled into full-blown spy rumors. In some versions, Worley was a secret German agent who had waited for the perfect moment to betray his ship. In others, he was a mad captain who had driven his crew to mutiny. There were whispers that he might have shot rebellious sailors, turned Cyclops toward a remote port, and scuttled the ship on purpose. The presence of Alfred Louis Moreau Gottschalk, the senior American diplomat who had boarded in Brazil to go home, only gave these stories more fuel. Gottschalk had already drawn criticism from some quarters for being too friendly with German circles while posted in South America. When he disappeared along with Worley and the crew, a few writers tried to stitch the two men together into one large plot, as if a consul and a captain had quietly driven a fully loaded Navy ship into the arms of the Kaiser. After the war, those spy tales ran into a wall called the German Archives. Allied investigators and later historians went through captured German naval records looking for any sign of Cyclops. If the ship had been taken as a prize or sunk by a submarine, there should have been some trace. A patrol report, a victory claim, a log entry. None turned up. German officials denied any knowledge of the ship, and there was no solid evidence of defection, capture, or a secret landing in a German port. With no confirmed enemy and no wreck, the rumor factory shifted to darker, sadder territory. Families and friends were desperate for anything that looked like a last message. That is where the message in a bottle stories came in. In the months and years after Cyclops disappeared, newspapers ran pieces about bottles supposedly found bobbing at sea, each one holding a note from a doomed officer or sailor. One report in a Philadelphia paper in 1919 described a bottle that claimed Cyclops had been attacked and that the writer was dying. It sounded like the perfect final chapter. But Navy officials quietly pointed back to their own work. They had already checked with Germany, already searched the known submarine tracks, and already concluded that there was no sign of an enemy strike. To them, the bottle story was almost certainly a hoax or a cruel joke. For families, though, it was not that simple. They had no bodies to bury and no grave markers to visit. There were no last radio calls they could hold on to, and no survivor to tell them what the final hours had been like. Any bit of writing that looked like a farewell, even if it was questionable, was hard to ignore. Decades later, the story of Cyclops' disappearance would be pulled into something much bigger and much stranger. The idea that a whole slice of the Atlantic Ocean was cursed. That idea did not start with Cyclops. In the early 1950s, a reporter in Miami wrote about several disappearances near Florida and the Bahamas and suggested something strange was happening there. A few years later, a writer named Vincent Gaddis drew a rough triangle on a map linking Florida, Bermuda, and Puerto Rico. In a 1964 magazine article, he wrote about ships and planes that had vanished inside that area and gave it a name that stuck: the Bermuda Triangle. Once that shape existed in people's heads, Cyclops was an easy ship to fold into it. The last leg of her route from Barbados toward the United States cut straight through the western side of that same stretch of ocean. She was large, she carried more than 300 people, and no wreck had been found. To writers who wanted to make the triangle sound deadly, she was perfect. Through the 1960s and 1970s, a wave of popular books and television shows turned that loose idea into a worldwide legend. Authors like Charles Berlitz wrote bestsellers that listed case after case and then leaned hard on wild explanations, from lost energy beams to the ruins of Atlantis. Cyclops often appeared in those pages as one of the Triangle's early proofs, even though none of the writers could point to new evidence about her fate. The details got stranger every time the story was retold. Some versions suggested that time itself behaved differently inside the Triangle. Others hinted at underwater gas eruptions, invisible whirlpools, or forces not yet known to science. For a general audience, these ideas were fun to talk about. For the families of the men who had sailed on Cyclops, they did little to answer the basic questions. What happened, and where did the ship go?
To date, that's the largest loss of life on board a U.S. Navy vessel. That's unexplained.
Now and then, someone thinks they may have found the answer on the seafloor. In the late 1960s, a wreck off the East Coast was briefly suggested as a match for Cyclops, but closer study showed that it did not line up with the coal ship's known design and likely route. Later, private search groups and writers such as adventure novelist Clive Cussler took an interest in the case and sponsored dives and sonar sweeps. Yet none of those efforts produced a confirmed find either. Once all the ghosts and spy tales are pushed to the side, what remains are the physical clues that can actually be measured: steel, ore, and weather. That is the point where modern engineers and scientists finally start to get some real traction on the mystery of Cyclops. What most likely destroyed the USS Cyclops? It begins with the ship type itself. Cyclops was one of 4 Proteus-class coal ships, all built to the same basic pattern, with long steel hulls cut into big cargo holds. One sister, the former coal ship Jupiter, lived long enough to be rebuilt as the Navy's first aircraft carrier. The other 2 sister ships, Proteus and Nereus, stayed in ore service after their Navy duty. Both vanished in the early years of the Second World War while carrying heavy loads of bauxite ore in the North Atlantic. They sent no clear last messages and left no confirmed wrecks. 3 related ships from the same design, all lost with dense ore cargoes in rough Atlantic waters, look less like random bad luck and more like a design problem showing up the same way. Rear Admiral George Van Doors, who studied these ships, focused on the long steel beams inside their hulls. Running from bow to stern were supports shaped like the letter I when seen from the end. Those beams carried both the weight of the cargo and the bending forces from waves. Van Doors argued that years of hauling rough, sometimes corrosive cargoes could quietly eat into those beams where water and dust sat against them. From the outside, the steel might look fine. Deeper in, it could be thinned and brittle. In that state, a hull might behave normally in moderate seas, but fail when a strong storm bends it far enough. The layout of the Proteus class made that weakness worse. These ships had long central holds with large hatch openings, so they could take deep piles of material. When you stack very heavy cargo in the middle of a long ship, the center section has to carry far more bending stress than the ends. If the inner beams there are already weakened, adding a full load of dense ore can push them close to their breaking point before the ship even meets bad weather. Fine ore also behaves in a nasty way when it gets wet, and the ship vibrates for hours. Ship safety experts now use the word liquefaction for this. If water leaks into the pile and waves shake the hull, the mix can stop acting like a solid block and start acting like thick liquid, so the cargo can slump or slide when the ship rolls and add uneven loads to the hull. Cyclops sailed before strict rules on cargo moisture and testing were in place. Her hatch covers were canvas instead of modern steel lids, and the gear around them was never built to seal out every bit of spray. Now put that ship and cargo into the sea conditions she likely faced. Weather records and later Navy reviews point to a strong storm in the western Atlantic around the second week of March of 1918.
One of the most enduring stories of the Bermuda Triangle is the disappearance of the USS Cyclops in 1918.
Roughly along the route from the Caribbean up toward the approaches to the United States. Other ships in the area reported high winds and heavy seas. For a slow coal ship already running on one engine and sitting low from a heavy ore load, this forecast was bad news. In rough seas, long ships bend over and over as waves pass under them. Sometimes the bow and stern ride high while the middle sags. Other times the middle lifts while the ends drop. Each wave puts stress on the ship's frame. If that frame is already weakened, and the heaviest cargo sits in the middle where the bending is worst, it does not take many hard waves for a hidden crack to finally give way. Retired officer Robert Nervig later argued that Cyclops likely broke apart near the middle and sank too fast to send a clear distress call or launch boats. A Navy history study supported a kind of chain reaction rather than one single cause. It noted that Cyclops was already running on one engine, which slowed her down and made it harder to face the waves, and that the ore cargo was unfamiliar and may not have been loaded in the safest way. In the middle of the 21st century, an independent analyst named Joe Pittner tried to test these ideas in a more structured way. In a paper called Causal Resolution of the USS Cyclops Disappearance, he compared many possible causes: enemy attack, explosion, and slow structural failure. against what is known about the ship's design, cargo, route, and the ocean conditions along her path. The explanation that ranked highest matched what engineers had already suspected. In this scenario, a long support beam inside the ship fails under the combined stress of heavy waves and the extreme weight of the dense ore. Once that beam gives way, the hull can no longer carry the load evenly. The ship rolls, the ore shifts as it turns into slurry, and the remaining structure collapses. The coal ship either breaks apart or floods so fast that it sinks in minutes, not hours. In that kind of sudden failure, it is not surprising that no clear distress call was sent. Radios at the time were limited, and a ship breaking suddenly might manage only a brief or incomplete signal, if any at all. Pittner also looked at where the ship might have ended up. Using the likely route from the Caribbean, the shape of the deep trench north of Puerto Rico, and known ocean currents, he estimated the most probable resting place. His model puts the wreck at roughly 27,000 feet deep, spread across a debris field only a few miles wide. At that depth, crude submarines cannot operate, and even modern unmanned robots are slow and expensive to use. Thanks for watching. Now check out the videos popping up on screen for more unbelievable stories.